Welcome to the Painting Coach. Now this video is a long one. We're painting Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels. It's a fantastic model. There's loads of detail on it. So let's get painting. First up, you can see the sub-assemblies that I'm going to use. So I've built most of the body of the Primarch and I've sprayed this black. I've sprayed the cape black, but I've also sprayed the inside with Zandri dust. I've sprayed the base with Zandri dust, and I've also sprayed the shield with Mephiston Red just to make it a lot easier and give me a nice head start. And it's really important to keep these sub-assemblies like this because it'll make it much easier to reach and paint later on. The first thing we'll work on is that nice green cloak and any other green material such as what's on the front of the line as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is base this with Caliban Green. Now you can see this is fairly thin, and that's very deliberate because we don't want to put it on too thick. We just want to make sure that we get a nice coverage. And if we need to go in and add a second coat, then we will. So just paint all of the cloak and any other green material bits in this nice Caliban Green colour. Once we've got a nice overall Caliban Green colour, we're going to add some shading. Now we're not going to use a wash, we're going to paint this shading in. And the colour we're going to use is a 50-50 mix of Caliban Green and Abaddon Black. Now this is okay in terms of how much depth you're going to add to the cloak. What you'll find is that when this dries, it will actually dry to a very similar colour to the Caliban Green. And this is great because this is what's going to help us get really nice transitions from the dark to the bright areas. We'll move on to the highlighting stage next, and the first colour we're going to use is a 50-50 mix of Caliban Green and Warpstone Glow. Now this is a slightly brighter green colour, and again I've thinned it down a bit with some water, and you can see this as it's going on. It's not covering completely in one coat, and again this is really key because this is going to help the blending when it comes to the latter stages. So essentially what I'm doing is painting all of the raised folds, leaving the darker colours in the recesses, but I'm really focusing on those raised areas to start. And what I'll do is once that's completely dry, I'll go back in and just focus on the raised folds again, just to give it a little extra layer of opacity to that green, which again is really going to help the blend without having to do anything too complicated. Once we're happy with that stage, we're going to pure Warpstone Glow. And with this, again, we're focusing on the most raised areas. And again, you can see that I've not actually got very thick paint. It's quite thin. And this is important, as I've said, all the way through, because as it dries, it'll blend down into the layer beneath, which will give us some nice transitions. Now, there are lots of folds on this cloak. There's lots of interest, and it's a fantastic piece to look at, especially from behind the model. So just take your time with this and work it into those areas above the kind of mix that you put on just now. So we're focusing on the most raised areas. If you feel that you need to blend it a little, then while the paint's still wet, just take a little bit of the previous mix and just blend it along that edge, and that'll give you a nice transition. Again, we're going to let this first coat dry. When it's completely dry, we're going to go back in and paint over the areas, focusing on the raised parts of the cloak, because this will give us more opacity and will help us with a nice transition. The final highlight we're going to put on the cloak is a nice bright one. It's a little bit of Moot Green. Now you can see again it's quite thinned down, which means when it dries it will blend into that layer underneath. And with this, we're not looking to do those big area highlights like we did in the previous stage. We're just looking to catch the most raised folds and the sharpest edges. So make sure you've got a good point on your brush. I've probably got a little bit too much paint on there, but I'm just going to work with it. So work your way around these raised edges, catching the shape of the mod where you can. You can use the sidery brush if you need to. And again, once that first layer dries, you can just go back in to reinforce the Moot Green for a nice sharp highlight. And that's all the green cloak material done. If we flip the cloak over, we've got a nice smooth coat of Zandri dust. We're going to take some Steel Legion Drab, and we're going to thin this down quite a bit with some water. And we're going to paint this into all those recesses. So again, once this dries, it'll blend down into that Zandri dust underneath. It's not too different a colour anyway, which is really going to help us get a nice subtle blend on this particular part. So just work your way down and paint it into all those recesses. Once it's dry, I'm going to take some Karak Stone and start to blend over the most raised folds. So again, this is a brighter colour than the Zandri dust, and it's obviously brighter than the Steel Legion Drab. So make sure you've not got too much on your brush. Again, I've probably got a little bit too much on mine here, so I am going to have to go and do some corrections. But we're just looking to catch those raised folds, and again, as it dries, it'll blend into those layers underneath. The first highlight layer is going to be a mix of Karak Stone and Pallid Wych Flesh. And this is fairly thin anyway, but we are just going to focus on those big areas. If you feel the need to go in and sort of do a bit of a smoother blend, like I'm going to have to on some of these areas, we're just going to use the previous mix to smooth that a little bit. But generally we're focusing on these big flowing bits of cloak, and it's always worth looking at the box art to see how much of this cloak is actually going to be visible. And what's really clear is that most of the visible parts are going to be those lower hanging areas and the bits that flare out to the side, so pay more attention to these. The last highlight is going to be with pure Pallid with flesh. Now you need to thin this down a bit, and it is a little bit of an awkward paint to work with sometimes. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to just blend this slightly. So I'm going to get a nice solid layer of Pallid with flesh on all these wide broad areas, and I'm just going to go back with that previous highlight colour just to feather the edges a little bit, as this will give us a nice smoother transition across the cloak. So it takes a little bit of time to work this in, but it really is worth it. We'll move on to the silver metallics next. Now there's not a huge amount of silver metal on the lion, but there are some significant parts, such as the nice design on the backpack. So the colour I'm using is dark aluminium from Vallejo Metal Colour. You can use lead belcher if you've got that, or any dark silver colour. Now this is a very straightforward part. I'm just painting this over all the areas that need it, taking my time. If you're not sure what bits of silver, again check the box art, but there are a few little bits here and there. Don't forget to paint the sword blade. Now I know there are some blue details on the sword, but we'll do those later on. We just want to get the basing done on the sword to start with. Next up, we'll shade all of the silver metallics using Nuln Oil. Now it's really important we get this to flow into those recesses and we don't let it pool too much on the silver parts of themselves. So just work your way around, make sure you haven't got a huge amount on your brush. If you do, like I have in some areas here, just make sure you wick it away so it doesn't settle and stain. We'll then highlight all of the silver using chrome from Vallejo Model Air. This is a really easy step. You just need to kind of catch those raised edges, but it's really important you haven't got too much on your brush, and your brush has got a nice good point on it. So work your way around catching the sharp edges. If you do make any mistakes, you can always paint over it. But I do find this a fairly easy and straightforward stage to get done. So just crack on and just make sure that you're being careful around parts you may have already finished. And if you haven't got chrome, just use Stormwood Silver. Now there's a fair amount of gold across the model as well, so the colour I'm going to use for this is Retributor Armour. So all I'm doing is just applying this to all the gold areas. So we've got things like the top of the backpack vents, we've got the iron halo, we've got a lot of trim, we've got the trim around the shield and the eagle icon on the shield, and don't forget those elements on the base you've got as well. I'm going to shade all of the gold using Reikland Fleshshade. Now this is the new version of the shade, so it does flow into those recesses a little bit better, and I do think it does give a better finish on gold than perhaps the old style of Reikland Fleshshade. So just work this around all the gold, make sure it doesn't pool too much in any recesses, but it should flow nicely into all those little bits of detail. The first highlight we'll apply is going to be with Liberator Gold. So that Reikland Fleshshade will have gone into those recesses really nicely, which means we can then start to apply the Liberator Gold. So essentially what we're thinking about, as opposed to an edge highlight in most places, we're just looking to paint the area where we think we're going to get this nice bright gold highlight. And by keeping the paint a little bit thin, this is a nice easy way of doing it, because it will blend into the layers underneath nicely as well. Now there are going to be parts of trim that we need to do, so we will use the edge of the brush. So when we're doing this, it's just really important to make sure we haven't got too much on our brush. Finally, we'll take some white gold from Pro Acryl and add this to the most raised and prominent areas that are going to catch the most light. So these are going to be the brightest. If you haven't got this colour, you can just mix a little bit, and I mean a very little bit, of that chrome or Stormwood Silver into the Liberator Gold, and this will give you this nice shiny white gold colour. The lion has got a red Dark Angels icon on his right vambrace. So the first thing I'm going to do is base this using Mephiston Red. And if you are painting the lion with the helmeted version, we're going to paint the feathers exactly the same way as this. So just get a nice solid coat of Mephiston Red down first. And then give it a quick shade of Nuln Oil to finish off. When that's completely dry, we'll take some Evil Sun Scarlet and we'll use this to highlight the majority of that Dark Angel icon. So we are going to use the shape of the brush and make sure that we don't spill into any of those recesses, but generally we want this to be a fairly bright red as per the box art. Next up, we'll take a little bit of Fire Dragon Bright and we're just going to use this to highlight the most raised areas. Now this is going to tip the colour to odds orange a little bit, and it is a lot brighter than the Evil Sun Scarlet underneath. We've probably missed a highlight colour, but I wanted to do it this way. But it's really important to get nice fine highlights here, so just take your time and you can always paint over any mistakes. Lastly, we'll just put a dot highlight of Ungor Flesh in the most raised parts, and this is just to simulate the reflection of light. So rather than it being flat, this gives the impression that there's a bit more depth to this particular decoration. Remember, if you're using the helmeted version, use this technique on there exactly the same. We'll paint all of the leather next, and we're going to base this using Mournfang Brown. So just take your time around bits you've already finished, and don't forget there are some leather straps on some of the watches on the base as well. So this is fairly easy and straightforward. You just need to make sure you've got a nice even coat across all of the leather. We'll then wash this with a little bit of Nuln Oil just to get into those recesses and start to bring out some of the detail. Don't worry if you get this on the armour, because we're going to repaint this later anyway. It's just important to get it in there so that we can start to pick out and highlight some of the detail. To bring out some of the detail, we'll take some Skrag Brown. Now this is a very bright orangey brown, and where we can, we're looking to just catch the shape of the model using the tip of the brush. And obviously moving it along the designed plastic, so we've got a nice hard edge to pull along and get the detail. So this is fairly straightforward and fairly easy to do in terms of highlighting, so it shouldn't pose too much of an issue. Again, don't forget there are some leather parts on the watches in the dark as well that need painting. We'll paint some of the white bits now, and apologies, this is a little bit bright in terms of the exposure, but essentially any bits that are going to be white, such as the angel wings, we're going to base these with Karak's white. Now I know a lot of people don't like Karak's white. I do. It is very lumpy and clumpy, but I find just a little bit of water on the palette and it does cover really well after 2 coats. We'll then shade all of that white using Soul Blight Grey. Now this needs a heck of a shake. I always use a vortex mixer to make sure that it doesn't stay separated, because it does have a tendency to sit at the bottom of the pot. So it does need a good shake, but essentially just painting it over all the white bits and you get a really nice easy shade there. Highlighting all of the white is pretty simple as well. We'll just take some bold titanium white from Pro Acryl and highlight the most raised edges, leaving that Karak's white and Soul Blight Grey shade in the recesses. If you haven't got bold titanium white, you can use whatever white you've got, whether that's White Scar, AK white, whatever you prefer, it should work fine. Moving on to the black leather next. So if you need to repair any of the black leather, use Abaddon Black to do this. And essentially the first highlight we're going to pop along the black leather is going to be with Mechanicus Standard Grey. And the reason I'm using this is because it covers really nicely and you don't have to fiddle around with it too much. So when you do an edge highlighting like this, it's really good at catching those raised areas and not spilling too much into recesses and having to go in and make any repairs. And again, don't forget there are black leather parts on the watches as well, in particular the sword scabbard. So just work your way around highlighting this as best you can. The final highlight on the black leather is with Administratum Grey, and we're just looking to catch the most raised edges and those parts that are going to catch the most light. So just working our way across it, making sure we haven't got too much on our brush and using a good point to get a nice crisp highlight. If you need to make any repairs, you can do so with either Mechanicus Grey or Abaddon Black. Let's move on to what I'm assuming is a lion skin on the back of the cloak, and we're going to base this using some Deathclaw Brown. Now previously I'd already painted with Zandri dust to make this step easier. If you haven't done that, don't worry, you'll just take an extra coat of that Deathclaw Brown all over it to make sure that you get a nice even coat. To shade this, we're going to take a little bit of Reikland Fleshshade. Now I'm putting this onto my wet palette and thinning it a little bit, because I don't want a heavy, harsh shade. I just want it to be fairly subtle and work into the recesses. So make sure you're not putting it on straight from the pot. Just a little bit of water and it'll flow nicely. We'll then start to build some of the texture back up using Deathclaw Brown. Make sure that Reikland Fleshshade is dry. And in terms of how we do this, we're just going to use nice strokes of the brush along the design of the fur that you've got there. So you start to build up a nice texture. We'll build up more texture next, and the colour we're going to use is Tau Light Ochre. And again, what we're doing is we're just taking the direction of the fur and we're just moving our brush along it in short, sharp strokes to build up further idea that this is real fur, not a flat palette. So we're just, like I said, moving the brush along the direction of that fur, short, sharp strokes. We'll then finish off that fur using some Ungor Flesh, which is a nice bright colour. Again, exactly the same way, short sharp strokes along the direction of the fur, really building up that texture nicely. Next up, we'll tackle all of the non-metallic gold elements on the cloak. Now, again, I've said this in every single video I've tried this, I'm not an expert at it. However, we'll do something simple to get a nice effect, and a big shout out to Anga Heraldez for this colour choices, which he's used on his Horus video. Is fantastic, so I thought I'd give it a go here. The first thing we're going to do is take some XV88 and just base all of those non-metallic gold areas. I want to get a little bit more contrast into this, so I'm then going to take some Nuln Oil, but I'm only going to paint this around the studded areas. So we've got lots of studs along this, so I just want to paint the Nuln Oil around them to give it a little bit of darkness. When that's completely dry, I'm going to take some Averland Sunset. Now this is fairly thin, so this is potentially maybe 1.5 part water to paint. I've not got too much on my brush either, and I'm just going to gently add this to the cloak along the areas which I think are going to catch the most light. So just take your time with this, making sure that you're leaving darker colours in the recesses, in particular if there are any depth of folds as well. And you might need maybe 2 and in some cases 3 coats to get a full coverage of this, because it's so thin and we're applying very little paint here. If you do make any mistakes, you can always go back in with the colour underneath to correct it. Next up, we're going to do exactly the same using some Dorn Yellow, again looking to catch those studs and the most raised edges of all of the gold. So I've not got too much on my brush, it is thinned down a little bit, but it is quite powerful as you can see here. I'm just working around catching the bits that I think are going to get the most light, and this is going to start to give that impression of a gold effect. The final thing we'll do is go in with a white colour, and again this is a pure white, so I'm just looking to catch the sharpest parts of where I think this gold colour, where these reflections are going to be. Taking my time, making sure that it flows off the brush quite nicely as well, but only adding very little. With the majority of the model done, it's time to have a look at the armour. So the colour we're going to use to base all of the armour is going to be a 50-50 mix of Caliban Green and Abaddon Black. Now what we're looking to do is leave the Abaddon Black in any recesses and shadows, so just take your time with this, but generally we're painting all of the armour. The first highlight, and it's going to be a fairly chunky highlight, is going to be with Caliban Green. Now this Caliban Green, once it dries, will blend down quite nicely into the mix underneath it. If you do put it too chunky or you make too much of a mistake, you can always paint over it with the base coat, but we're just going to work our way around all of the armour, getting a nice chunky highlight. As we're going for a slightly desaturated armour colour to reflect the box art, the next highlight is going to be with Sunz of Horus Green. So what we're looking to do is paint this inside that Caliban Green highlight from the last stage. So just take your time with this, working your way around, making sure to catch all those edges that are going to catch the most light. We don't want to paint this over the entirety of that green highlight, the Caliban Green highlight, but we do want to get the majority of it. And remember, if you make any mistakes, just paint over with the undercolour. To continue highlighting the armour, we're going to take some Krieg Khaki, and we're going to make a 50-50 mix of Krieg Khaki and that Sunz of Horus Green from the last step. And what we're looking to do here is a much more refined highlight of those areas that are going to catch the most light, and we're not adding too much to the model. We're just working our way around and catching them as best we can using the shape of the brush. Now it's really important we haven't got too much on the brush, and it's really important we've got a nice good point on there as well. For the final spot highlight, we're going to add a little bit of white into that previous mix, so it's going to be a third Krieg Khaki, a third white, and a third Sunz of Horus Green. So as I'm working on the palette, I'm just adding it all in. And we're just going to use this as a spot on the sharpest bits of armour, such as the pointy parts on the knee, any edges that we've got. And this is really going to help set that armour off, and it is a much different green colour than we've got on the cloak as well. Now the armour has got a lot of studs and rivets across it, so to paint these we're going to use a silver colour. Now I'm going to use a bright silver so that it really does stand out and catch the light. I'm just going to use that chrome from Valeur Monolaire. This is really simple. Make sure you haven't got too much on your brush and just touching it across all the stud work across all of the armour. It's nice and easy and nice and straightforward. To paint the shield, the first thing we're going to do is take some Nuln Oil and paint this all over that Mephiston Red spray coat. Now I did paint this the same time as the rest of the model, so the gold that you see on the shield is exactly the same as the gold elsewhere, but this is just the first part of that section. When that's completely dry, I then took a second coat of Nuln Oil and worked this into those areas that I felt were going to be in shadow as well. And this ended up being the majority of the shield, just to get that nice darker red. The first highlight is with Evil Sunz Scarlet, which is a nice bright red. And you can see here I'm being very careful about how I apply it, making sure that I haven't got too much on my brush. I'm just looking to edge highlight inside the armour, as well as catch any raised areas and paint along some of the decoration on the shield as well. So this is just a case of working your way around, being very careful. Now if you need to repair this, it's a little more difficult because of the shading that you put on underneath, but you can just repaint some areas and reshade if you need to. The next highlight is going to be with Wild Rider Red, and essentially what we're looking to do here is get an even thinner highlight and paint this inside that Evil Sunz Scarlet. So wherever you paint that Evil Sunz Scarlet, we want a nice crisp Wild Rider Red highlight. Lastly, we're going to take some Fire Dragon Bright. We're just going to use this as a bit of a spot highlight on the sharpest edges and the parts of the shield that are going to catch the most light. To paint the Purity Seal strips, we're going to use Rakarth Flesh. So just take your time with this and make sure that you get a good solid coat. If you need to put 2 coats on, then that's what you're going to have to do. This is a fairly easy and enjoyable part anyway, so there are plenty around the lion. Just take your time, especially around parts you've already finished. Once we've got a nice solid base coat, we're going to shade all of these using Seraphim Sepia. Now this has got a habit of really pooling in the recesses and really discolouring the Rakarth Flesh, and this can mean that it's really difficult to get a nice smooth highlight on there. So just be careful where it's dry, and if you need to, wick it away from those recesses. The first highlight we're going to apply is going to be back to that original Rakarth Flesh, and we're just looking to stab some highlights across these purity seals, leaving that Seraphim Sepia in the recesses. Finally, we'll take some Pallid Witch Flesh and use this to highlight all of those edges and any particularly sharp folds that you've got on the purity seals. Again, make sure you haven't got too much on your brush, and where you can, drag your brush along the shape of the model to get a nice crisp highlight. For the wax seals, we'll just base these using Screamer Pink. Now, take your time with this because it can be difficult to get it on just the purity seal, and I've got far too much on my brush in this video, so make sure that you haven't got too much on yours. We'll then take a little bit of Pink Horror and we'll use this to highlight all of the wax around the outside, and on some of them we'll have a design on the inside that we need to highlight as well. Depending on which head option you go for on the lion, you will have several options. Now if you use the helmeted head or the hooded helmet head, then you've already got all you need to do that. If you're going to use either the bear head or the hooded bear head, then this step is for you. The first thing we're going to do is base the face using Bugmans Glow. When that Bugmans Glow is dry, we're then going to start to highlight using a mix of Cadian Fleshtone and a Shabti Bone. And essentially what we're looking to do is catch all of the raised areas, leaving that darker colour in all the recesses, and this will start to set up the face quite nicely. For the next highlight, we're going to add some more Shabti Bone into the mix. So we're looking at 2 parts Shabti Bone to 1 part Cadian Fleshtone. And again, we're focusing on the most raised areas such as the brow, the nose, the cheekbones and the eyelids. And for the last highlight, we're going to add a little bit of white into that mix, not too much, just to brighten it a little bit. And we're just going to focus again on the most raised areas, so the parts that are going to catch the most light, like the nose, the brow, that big forehead he's got with his nice tied back ponytail as well. This is fairly thin, so when it dries it will blend down nicely as well. For painting the lion's beard and his hair, the first thing we're going to do is base it all using Zandri dust. Now this is a really nice colour that should cover in one hit. Obviously be very careful around the parts that you've already finished as well. Once that's dry, we'll start to highlight all those strands of hair using a Shabti Bone. So just take your time with this, make sure you haven't got too much on your brush and you do have a nice good point on there. And essentially what we're looking to do is follow the sculpt and the design on the model, painting in a downwards motion, which means that we're going to have a brighter colour towards the ends rather than at the part where the brush touches the model. So this will really help with some of the blending as well. Finally, take some Screaming Skull and use this just to highlight on the bottom part of all that hair. Again, this is just going to help in terms of adding texture and getting a really nice effect that will look great on the model. So use this fairly sparingly. We're looking to focus around the parts like the bottom of the beard and also where the hair and the face and the hairline is along there. just to help it stand out. Painting the gems is really easy. The first thing you need to do is base them all using white. Now I'm using, again, bold titanium white. Use whatever white you prefer. Once you've done that, you can just use a little bit of contrast paint. So I'm going to use some Blood Angels Red and some Frostheart on the shield. As for the sword itself, I've painted the power nodes with a little bit of white paint as well. And I'm going to use some Frostheart over there to give a blue glow. I'm also going to use some Frostheart over the blade, and I'm going to make sure I clean my brush off and then just drag this around to blend it in a little bit. So it gives the impression that the power nodes are very blue and very alive and very electric, and it just blends out into a nice silver metallic further down. Moving on to the base, like I said, I sprayed it Zandri dust. We're going to paint the Watchers, and they've got a nice dark burgundy colour cloak. So the first thing we're going to do is paint it all using Sigvald Burgundy contrast paint. So take your time with this, especially around areas you may have already finished. When that's completely dry, I want to darken these cloaks even further, and the colour I'm going to use for this is Nuln Oil. So I'm just going to paint this all over that Sigvald Burgundy. So it's really important this dry. We're just going to let this settle in those recesses. The first highlight we're going to do is with Scream Pink, and we're going to use this along the robes, and this is a nice easy section really. We're just going to catch the most raised parts. Now if we keep this Screamer Pink fairly thin, what it also means is that if we accidentally paint it over some darker parts we don't want it to, it will blend in quite nicely, so that even though it looks quite stark whilst the paint is wet, as it dries it does give you a nice blend, and it does give you a nice transition as well. Moving on to the next step, and the colour we're going to use is Pink Horror. And we're going to do exactly the same here, making sure we've got a decent point on our brush, and we're just going to catch those raised bits of cloak. Now if you apply it a little too thick, you can always go back in and add some Screamer Pink over it once it's dried, but generally what we want to do is make sure that we're just following the lines of the model based on the sculpt. So this is again fairly easy and straightforward, and as it dries it will blend in quite nicely. The last thing we'll do is add some text to some of these purity seals. Now these are fairly elaborate purity seals. If you look at the box art, we're just going to add some text. So I've just got some Rhinox hide, I've watered it down, and I'm just going to paint lots of thin lines along these purity seals, taking my time to make sure that I don't let the paint blob or pool too much, and that's all there is to it. So there we have it, the Lion is ready for the tabletop, ready to lead his Risen Dark Angels and also the Chapter of Dark Angels as well. This is a model that's absolutely packed full of detail, so I hope you managed to bear with me throughout the entire tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know by leaving a like and a comment down below. Now I bet you're probably wondering how I painted all the stones on the base and the rest of it. Well, check out this video here that'll show you exactly how I did it. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.